I'm very, very proud to introduce Jane McManus, who's a journalist for ESPN, the New York Times, and other esteemed outlets, who is here today to share with us her experiences in women's sports. And also, she's just released this book. This was released about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, end of February.
End of February, so about
end of February, about a month.
Yeah, about a month ago. We expect this is going to be a bestseller. Is it on the bestseller list yet?
Well, I haven't been notified, but I'm sure that's just a delay.
Yeah, of course. Your editor is waiting
exactly.
on the good news. So this is a book that she's just released, and we're really happy to have her here with us. This event is also sponsored by Media and Communications Department, as well as the the Interdisciplinary Studies program as well. Any interdisciplinary students here? Not yet. Dr. Liz Duclos-Orsello is, where is she?
She is on a personal situation.
Oh, okay. I thought she was doing a conference or something. Anyway, wonderful to see all these students here. I'm happy to have you here. And our plan is going to be kind of fluid. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So Jane's going to share with us her story. She's going to talk about her experiences, her publications, the work that she does in the sports world. And then myself and Dr. Bloom will have a couple of questions that we'd like to ask her, and then we'll open it up for further questions. So without any further ado, we have an hour.
Great.
Let's have some fun.
Let's use it wisely. Thank you all so much for coming here today. I hope you get something out of it. And I really like back and forth. So if you have questions or you have a comment, an observation, I feel like, I have 2 kids, 22 and 20, and I know your generation has a real front row seat to how things are different than they were for me. And things are really in flux now in a couple of sports, particularly name, image, and likeness, particularly the business of women's sports, and also sports betting and legalization around that. Those 3 areas are really changing some of the kind of traditional dynamics in the state. And and I think also science, and we can get to that later. But I'll tell you guys a little bit about my background first, so you just know the context that I'm coming from. I was born in 1971, and that's the year before Title IX was passed. And so I kind of look at my life and my career, how it kind of dovetails with Title IX and the changes that's brought, the opportunities and the resistance to Title IX, which was very strong, certainly in the first 20 years of its life. So I was born in Virginia, and I lived there until I was 11. I was a tomboy. There weren't a lot of opportunities for girls my age in that area to play sports. I was raised by a single mom. My parents got divorced when I was 2. So she was hustling and didn't have a lot of time to put me in the car and take me to a practice here and then spend a weekend in Delaware for a tournament. That was not my life. So I played outside. I played with other kids from the neighborhood. There was a big field behind the apartment complex where I lived, and we would play baseball out there, and there was a huge rock for second base. And that was a precarious thing when you were running full speed. But that was the kind of thing. We climbed trees, we pulled garbage out of the trash, and we put it in our clubhouse in the back of the woods. That's how I kind of grew up. So I didn't play organized sports. I tried to 1 year, but my mother didn't get the physical done through the doctor's office, so that was that. I was the manager for the 7th grade girls basketball team, which went 2-12, and that was the end of my managing career. So, but I started playing in college. I got to St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. It's a small liberal arts school. I'd done some reporting for my high school paper, and I'd been the editor of my junior high paper, so I had that background. And when I got to college, it's basically a liberal arts college. I was studying philosophy. But I was also playing basketball all the time. So I started playing for the intramural men's and women's teams and my brother sister teams. I had a really good outside shot. So I played a ton of basketball, and I was playing pickup, many nights. Gym rat is what they called me back then. But when I moved to New York after I graduated, I kept playing pickup. Usually I was the only woman to do that. Played in Prospect Park Y was like my home gym, and then I played once on West 4th Street with actual basketball players and won the game, which was amazing. But that was the end of my West 4th Street career as well. So didn't know what I wanted to do for a living though. I was living and breathing basketball in New York and working at a law firm. Realized I didn't want to go to law school, and so a friend of mine, we were rollerblading in Prospect Park, and she said, you should be a sports writer. It's kind of all you do. It's all you think about or care about. And I was like, oh my gosh, I should be a sports writer. But I didn't know how you go about doing that. There weren't a lot of role models for me to look to. But I went to grad school, Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. I was told not to tell them that I wanted to study sports because they would not take me seriously. So I kept that to myself. I had a secret going into grad school. But, and when I got out, I started kind of working my way up. I was still playing basketball. I was still, loved sports, but started working in, covering high schools and figuring out how to cover lacrosse or baseball. Because again, I was really into basketball, but I didn't know a ton about other sports. Certainly not from like that expert perspective. Worked at the Journal News for about 10 years, had 2 kids. Kind of was surprised to see that, I thought when I got to being a sports writer that, because I wanted to cover the Knicks for the New York Times. Like that was my career goal. I was not thinking I wanted to cover women's sports. There really wasn't women's sports to cover back then anyway. So I just wanted to cover some basketball. And then I started to kind of see that I thought everybody was going to understand that I was there because I love sports and I was a player. Like that I was a scrapper, that I love sports just as much as anybody else did. But when I got in, I realized that like I was seen as a woman first, not as somebody who played basketball and was there because I won the 1993 NCAA tournament bracket in my law firm. So I kind of started to notice that these dynamics that affected the way women's sports were platformed and viewed and talked about also affected me personally in my career. I was going to escape all those dynamics. I thought they'd be gone by the time I got into the business. But lo and behold, I got mommy tracked. I got, all of these things that I thought were going to happen to the generation before me and not for me because I'm here because I belong here. And that was a tough education for me to realize that I didn't get to escape those dynamics. I think, they are still there. Wherever you are, whatever your identity is, wherever you sit, however you feel different, those are things that can impact you in the workforce too. And so it's important to kind of understand what they are at least, because otherwise you're going to feel like it's me. Is it me? Is it my problem? Did I do something wrong? It's not you. It's not you. So, but anyway, I told myself I was going to outlast the mommy tracking, and I did. And so I went, covered Final Fours, started covering the Jets for the newspaper, and then left to cover the Jets for ESPN and become an NFL analyst. Did a lot of TV shows. I did a couple of radio shows, Operation Football with Randy Scott and Field Yates. I also did a show called The Trifecta with Sarah Spain and Kate Fagan. That was the first 3-woman radio show on Sports Talk Radio. And that was a great time. We had a ton of fun. I was one of the first columnists for ESPNW. There were 5 at the beginning and I was one of them. And I remember thinking, if I take this job, that could be kind of interesting, but it also might affect my career because I was covering the NFL. Like that was the top tier beat at ESPN. But I really cared, I'd watched a lot of women's sports be dismissed. I was subject to a lot of those forces at ESPN too. And I was like, if this is going to be stronger if I get behind it. And so I decided to get behind it. So this year, I'm at NYU now. I'm teaching there. I was edited the year's best sports writing, which is an annual anthology. I'm the 3rd woman to have done this, to have edited this book since it came out in 1991, I think. 3rd one. There are more stories about women in this book than there have ever been before, and it's still not half. So I think, that's something to keep in mind as much as like we talk about, I was unapologetic. Part of me was like, yeah, I am picking a lot of stories about women, but you know what? That interests me, and I think they're well written, and I'm putting them in this volume. So not apologizing for that. And then I also pitched this book in 2020, The Fast Track. Because I thought I saw some things changing. The conversation around U.S. women's soccer after their World Cup victory in 2019 was important. And then And then, you know, we saw what happened since then, right? The pandemic, the WNBA, and the NWSL were the first two sports to play live. And you have this conversation around equity stemming from that World Cup in 2019 that then crosses post-pandemic into women's basketball with Sedona Prince, showing the small triangle of weights in that little viral video, and then the palace of the ballroom that had been dedicated to the men's weight room in the NCAA men's bubble. So, I mean, I know you guys are watching both tournaments now, and you know, the women in the tournament are not slacking on their workouts. You know, they are there because they are incredibly fit. And so to offer them just a small triangle of weights for a whole group of teams in the bubble for that year was so disrespectful. It disrespects all the effort that those women were putting into their bodies to get in shape to play in that tournament. And then they're gonna get there and what, not lift? Like, I mean, anyway. So I started thinking about this in terms of not just a story about one woman who overcame the odds, which a lot of people were hoping I would write, but about the systems in place that are elevating women's sports now to like a new height, but also the historic reluctance over the years, the hostility. You know, I use the analogy, you know, if you didn't like a particular food, let's say you didn't like potatoes, and you got potatoes as a side dish at a restaurant, you probably wouldn't eat it, you'd put it to the side of your plate, no big deal. You wouldn't walk into the kitchen and demand that they take potatoes off the menu. You wouldn't look at your fellow diners and say, how dare you? Why on earth would you eat potatoes? You wouldn't go to the owner of the restaurant and demand it be taken off the menu. But that's what happens in women's sports. That's the kind of hostility in the space sometimes for women. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's not just like, oh, people didn't care about women's sports. There's been hostility holding women's sports back over the years. I think we're at a place now where it's important to name that. And so when I wrote this, I wanted to write about all the great things that are happening, the investment, the athletes, the cross-promotion, the marketing, the enthusiasm, but I also want to keep in mind the history and the context because, you know, progress isn't inevitable and you don't always keep the gains that you see. And so I think it's important to recognize that and to keep that in mind when we talk about women's sports. So that's why I wrote the book. How's that?
Great introduction, absolutely. I guess that's my prompt now to start thinking of questions to ask.
Or I could just keep monologuing.
Well, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, and we kind of practiced it a little bit on the way over, and this has something to do with the class that I'm teaching, which is a U.S. sport history class. And that's right, shout out. And it's a DPDS class, so we are covering sensitive issues in the class. And so from the standpoint of women's athletics, women's sports, we've been beginning to explore the challenges that women have faced over the years, many, many years, too long, it should be stated, way too long.
A couple millennia.
It's from the beginning of time, you might say, yeah. And
in Western culture, there are other places in the world where it's not where it hasn't been historically. There have been ebbs and flows in terms of the dynamics.
Okay.
But maybe not in sports.
Is Marissa, is the sound, where's Marissa? Is the sound working okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So one of the things that I've been sharing with my students is that history is a study of change over time. And I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is, from your research and from your own experiences, are you seeing changes to women's sports and the acceptance of women's sports in our current culture? What kind of changes have you seen from when you started and got into this to now?
Incredible change. So I think there are three major waves in my lifetime. Again, 1971 I was born. So 1971, the early 1970s, along with the civil rights movement, you had a lot of interest in women's sports. You had Title IX was passed. It wasn't originally passed as a law that would give women access to playing fields in college. But it did because it didn't prohibit it in the language of the statute. And people started to read it and say, well, why not? Why shouldn't it apply to women's sports? It's educational opportunities. And in this country, we've made the decision to tie athletic opportunities with educational opportunities. And so there was no reason that was off limits. There was a lot of litigation for years and years, but eventually that prevailed. Same time, that same wave, you have the WTA being formed, women's tennis. Billie Jean King beat Bobby Riggs. 1972 was the first year that women could legally run the Boston Marathon. Not that long ago. So that was the first wave. And then you have the late 90s. The late 90s was 96, the Atlanta Olympics. 4 women's teams in America won gold in America. So it was basketball, soccer, gymnastics, and I always blank on the 4th one, but it was 4. It wasn't softball, because I don't think softball was... No, but anyway, it was 4. We can go back and look it up at some point. But you also
Probably
had,
something in swimming, maybe.
maybe something like that. But it was teams. It was teams.
Team.
American women's team.
Oh,
There
okay,
have been
okay.
times where, like for example, tennis and figure skating, like individual sports for women, have had popularity, for the last 50 years. But it's the team sports that have really had a hard time finding traction. But that late 90s, you also had the World Cup. The women won the World Cup in 1999 at the Rose Bowl, and they filled the Rose Bowl, every single seat in the Rose Bowl, and that was proof of audience. But that wave dissipated also. There were 3 leagues born immediately out of that, the WNBA, the ABL, and WUSA. Only one of those survives today, and it's because of its association with the NBA, and the NBA kind of keeping it alive. So that dissipated, and then now I think you're in your 3rd wave of my lifetime. And what makes it different? Well, you have a historic investment. We are a capitalist society, and revenue talks. So what is it that makes this different is audience. There is an audience for women's sports. How does that get proved, right? Because mainstream media didn't have a ton of interest in platform women's sports. How do you define an audience when no one can tune in necessarily to watch on television? Well, one of the things that you do is you have social media, the emergence of social media, and you have women who play sports joining that platform. And lo and behold, Megan Rapinoe has 2 million followers on Instagram in 2015. Serena Williams, same thing. Like 2 million people bothered to click follow for those women. And that proves an audience. And so you have companies that are looking for influencers. Well, you're not going to ignore the biggest influencers out there, who play women's sports. So you have that, and then I think you have the pandemic. After the pandemic, the conversation around equity, there's more of a concern. The NCAA, because they commissioned a report that shows that they've been inequitable for so long, is shamed into providing more equal coverage. ESPN is kind of shamed into providing more equal coverage for men's and women's basketball. By the way, ESPN has had the rights for the women's basketball tournament for 20 years. It does not have the rights to the men's basketball tournament, which are owned by CBS. But ESPN Sports Center, if you tuned in during March Madness, would always be showing the men's tournament and not highlights from the women's tournament. But that has changed now as well. So you have the accessibility of those games. And when you have that, then you can start marketing. It turns out that the way women pay attention to sports and the way fans of women's sports pay attention to sports is different. And now, but instead of saying, oh, who cares, that's hard to figure out, we don't know how to reach that audience, it's too big to ignore now. And so you have some of the storytelling around who this audience is. Companies want to know because they want to sell products to the people who care about that stuff. They want to sell merchandise to the people who care about that stuff. How many stories have you seen about WNBA jerseys or US women's soccer jerseys selling out right away? Well, that's because they're not making enough jerseys, Like that's money left on the table for those leagues. You don't want to leave money on the table. We live in a country where, it's about how much revenue you're bringing in, what the attention is like. And I think now you see, people and investors are starting to see that there is a higher ceiling for women's sports than they thought was possible in terms of making money. Last year, women's Final Four rated higher than the men's Final Four for the first time ever. 18.9, I think was the rating. 18 million, over 18 million people, because ratings are a little fudgy. Over 18 million people tuned into that game. That's paradigm busting. That's a paradigm busting number. And so when you have numbers like that, you have volleyball day, 92,000 people filled Memorial Stadium to watch four teams play volleyball. We have a volleyball guy here. That's paradigm busting. Like these things are doing so much better. They say if you build it, they will come. And sometimes that's true, but it's really been true lately in women's sports.
That's part of what we're beginning to explore in our class that I'm teaching and other classes as well, is what's the investment opportunity in women's sports? Why is it such an attractive investment? Is it an attractive investment?
Yeah. Well, it is. It's not exactly like the investment space in men's sports. I think, we make a mistake when we say, an NWSL team has to be sold for the same amount that the Cowboys would be sold for, or else it doesn't matter. Like, NASCAR isn't as big as the NFL, but nobody discounts NASCAR's ability to exist as a business and a sport and be interesting and attract fans and live and exist. So the WNBA, which is now more popular than NASCAR, also has it has become pretty sizable. So you could have probably bought in for an NWSL or a WNBA team for about $2 million, maybe $10 million, like 5-6 years ago. That's not possible now. Now those expansion team rights fees are going for like $200 million. Like that is the type of difference that we're talking about. There are different ownership models also in women's sports than in men's sports. Ownership models, let's use the Cowboys as an example again. Jerry Jones, one guy, party bus, family run operation. In women's sports, take Angel City, the NWSL's Angel City, you have a collaboration. You have Alexis Ohanian, who's Serena Williams' husband, Julie Foudy, Mia Hamm, Natalie Portman, actress. So it's like the coolest club in LA that you want to get into is this ownership group. They go to those games, there's star power at those games, it's like an event. It's a different model altogether than the billionaire. And I think that kind of, those investment opportunities, it widens it up. My friend Sarah Spain, who works at ESPN and who I did the radio show with, she bought into the Chicago Sky. Or the Red Stars, I'm sorry, the NWSL team, not the WNBA team. Because she thought it would be fun. And she was able to do that and become part of that consortium. And they got bought out by Laura Ricketts. She made money on the deal. She made a lot of, Laura Ricketts is part of the family that owns the Chicago Cubs, that Ricketts family. Anyway, so those are the kind of opportunities that are available. And that's a margin of order different than it's been in the past. Companies are also utilizing players in women's sports to sell products, and those fees are going way up. NIL is an opportunity also for players in women's sports and at the college level. There was one other thing I was going to say. Why is this different? Oh, rights fees. The main driver of salaries in any professional sports are right fees for broadcast fees. So those are going up now. I think that the WNBA renegotiated for $2 billion, which is again paradigm busting money. So that's the kind of, so any when we talk about pay equity also, which is a big issue, that's a little bit different in women's sports, because when you talk about collectively bargained wages, and all of these leagues have unions. I covered the NFL and the Players Association for a long time, so that's kind of my way of coming to it. But every league, player salaries are a function of revenue. And so you have to have a certain amount of revenue coming in before you can start talking about raising player salaries. Yes?
Let's talk about college sports. So I used to do college sports at my previous college, and it was different when it comes to scholarships and funding and such. So with me, I did cross country, and it was weird because the funding was kind of it was one program, it was one sports program for two different opposite teams for men and women.
Right.
And the thing is, I guess how the position works. So I was captain, it was just me, and then they had multiple male captains, and I felt there's a whole different level between saying oh, this woman's a captain, we need three, why does she get to be a captain, such and such. When it comes to the funding too, it's somehow we shared a pool, I think, of money together, and I feel that's felt different because we had less women that wanted to participate, and I felt with funding we got less money compared to maybe other sports. The football team had so much funding, though they had all these players that they did not even need. People just kind of sat there. And so, what about the funding? They could be using that money to actually do sports that are actually are active, not just people just being benchmarked in a way.
Yeah, so there's still a lot of inequity when it comes to college sports and the way resources are divvied out at most colleges. I think there's been, there's academic research that exists on this that still shows there's the discrepancy is within, it's I don't know, what, 60, 40, 70. It's I don't know the number off the top of my head, but you can go to Google Scholar and find scholarly reports that will give you bigger picture, that will show your anecdote actually meets with research, and that you're onto something. Title IX, Title IX doesn't have a police force. Title IX doesn't have an enforcement mechanism that has been utilized since its existence. So really it is on good faith. And, when you have a lot, just like the NCAA, which was supposed to be overseeing both men's and women's basketball in the same way, but was clearly giving a lot more resource and care to the men's side of it than the women's. And again, a nonprofit organization. They're not a revenue generating organization. So, just like your school would be when it's in that situation too. Like that's you have to think about what is the goal of college sports. Is the goal of college sports to educate athletes, mind, body, and soul, like it was intended in the late 1800s when this idea of amateurism really took root, or is it to drive revenue? And those are two different things. Those are two different goals, and you act differently based on which way you're looking at things. Yeah.
Sorry. So I guess with scholarships, so they had scholarships for the sports minus cross country, but then I guess after I left I transferred here, so it was weird because I started seeing how they were trying to get sponsorship, and they used this, I forgot what the company was called, where you can buy, I guess, like a T-shirt or the name with their last name on it.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Like, what do you think about that? Because I feel like it seems different because you're basically just having your friends buy. Like, are you really making money off it? And I feel like it's also college where this is D3, so you're not really trying to make a profit. I don't know how like trying to make a profit without other sports without taking more money, but it's like what's a scholarship? Because there's other sports where they have scholarship for student athletes and such, or recruiting wise, like our sport, like we had no scholarship. So I don't know how does that work and how that.
It does. I mean, you could certainly raise it with the title. I mean, you're not there anymore, but you could have raised it with the Title IX coordinator at your school. I don't know if you'd have found a lot of satisfaction on it. The fact of the matter is that again, there's no police officer that's going to knock on the door and say, get your house in order. That's just, that's the way it's supposed to be. Equitable. Also, it's not equal. It's like equitable. There are multiple ways to try to satisfy Title IX, and one of them is moving toward providing opportunities. So that means that the opportunities are not equal. And, depending on whatever your school, whichever prong they're trying to fulfill, your experience is going to be different.
David, I see your hand. Well, go ahead. Let's hear your question.
You said that for the female sports is different. How did that come to be?
The what for?
The audience, like the way.
Yeah, the audience. So I think, audience for men's sports are like 70-30 male viewers to female viewers. Audiences for women's sports, except for the NFL, where it's 47% women. Like there's a higher number of women who watch the NFL than most other sports. Audience for women's sports tends to be about 60-40 men to women. So not a majority of women watching. I think what we're seeing now that there's been more data that's been put together on this and research is that people may not be fans and consume women's sports in the same way they consume men's sports. It may be more about following athletes, learning about who they are, engaging with them on some level, ingesting parts of games. A lot of people from my era would turn on the Yankees game at the beginning and watch it until, the end of the night. That's not a way that a lot of people are consuming, NWSL games, for example. And I don't think it's a lot of the way that your generation is consuming games anymore either. You're watching synopses on social media, you're maybe streaming something, it's a little bit different. It's, not so much like beginning to end. So I think research is being done around, it's not about, well, if people don't consume women's sports in the exact same way that they consume men's sports, then we discount the audience. I think that was the approach for decades. But now it's like, okay, so if they're not consuming it in the same way, how do we meet the needs of that audience? Because again, you'd never discount a NASCAR audience. So you're talking about audiences that are the same size, if not bigger. Particularly for the women's, NCAA tournament. Like, those audiences are huge. So I think, and we'll see what the numbers are this year, without Caitlin and Angel now that they've gone off to the WNBA. But I think those, ESPN said that it had higher ratings for the regular season this year of the NCAA of basketball games, D1 basketball, than it has ever had before. So even in the year of Caitlin and Angel. So I think we're seeing, at least, preliminarily, we're seeing a lot of that interest is sustained rather than falling off. So I think it's how you meet the audience, how you measure an audience. There are different kinds of audiences. If you're really interested in it, I have a chapter in the book about how advertising is sold. sports have often been used as the vehicle to sell advertising to men, so to sell products to men. And if you have women's games and it's still the majority audience is male, you're not selling products to women through that programming because it's a mixed gender audience. And the fact of the matter is that gendered audience or gendered advertising has been the way that products have been sold in this country for a long time, and particularly through sports. So it creates a conundrum then when it comes to platforming in sports. Can you pay for that programming through the advertising in the same way if you're not able to access your same advertisers? So you have to go outside and find products that want to sell to men and to women. So it's really complicated. It's not an easy answer necessarily, but I think ESPN for a long time just raised up its hands and said, that seems hard, we're not going to do it. But now I think they're getting to a place where people do want to do it because they see the force and the strength and the buying power of that audience around women's sports.
Jane, I'm wondering, is NIL a positive force in college sports?
I mean,
NIL being name, image, and likeness. Now college athletes can make money.
Yeah. So I think it depends on where you sit. If you're an administrator, it's a terrible thing because it's really complicating the system for you. If you're a college athlete, it's a great thing because now you're able to make money. I think sometimes the same biases, like for example, if you're a black woman, however, and you're playing, then it's less good for you because you're not getting as large a piece of the pie. So if your name ends with the word Sanders, then it's a great thing because you're getting lots of NIL money if you're Deion Sanders' kid. So I think it depends again on where you sit. I think it's complicated in the same way that anything is complicated, that the rewards of NIL aren't going to go to everybody. And so the idea of equity is a bit imperiled by that. If you have one member of a basketball team that's making a lot of NIL money and the other 11 are not, then that can present a dynamic. I think the transfer portal is also, which kind of goes along with that, has been a real headache for colleges. But again, I kind of look. The original sin of this is that institutions decided to take a lot of broadcast money from CBS. In the early 1990s when those rights were sold to CBS for $1 billion, I think in '92, and then now it's $1 billion a year that the NCAA gets from CBS. A lot of that money is redistributed according to a very complicated formula based on who wins different games. But at the same time, you can't have institutions you can't have $1 billion washing through a system and call it amateur sports anymore. And so rather than tackle how are we going to adjust the system based on this money coming in, it kind of kicked the can down the road for so long that now, I think it's a mess. I don't know, what do you think? You look at this.
Well, I still don't know how NIL works, quite frankly.
Okay.
Where's the demand come from? Caitlin Clark makes, I don't know how much she made with NIL. Who's footing the bill for that? Is that private companies that are investing?
So this is a way that athletes can get paid, but institutions don't have to pay them. So institutions like colleges don't have to pay them. So what it was designed to do is to keep all that money in a system and kind of untouched, that NCAA money that was coming in pre-NIL, and find external money for the athletes. So the external money then comes from the car dealership that wants to hire Caitlin Clark and put her on a billboard, or the social media post that they do about a weight loss team, which gets them a certain amount of money. I think there are some schools where if you post an ad, you're getting 10 grand a post, depending on, and that's external money. It's kept out of the system, and it's useful if you have an agent that can help connect you with those deals. But if you're a backup volleyball player, so if you're on a team that doesn't get the limelight, or you're at a school, like a D3 school, or you're a school that's not as popular or well known for sports, or a team that isn't successful, then that's not going to be something that you can really have access to in a real way. So it's an issue of equity.
Right.
But also, the men's teams are going to, because we're talking about revenue generating, and I think you can probably put a lot of women's basketball teams in that category now. But if we're talking about revenue generating sports, as football and men's basketball primarily, those are going to get the bulk of the NIL. And that's actually where schools and these collectives that sit outside schools schools, like the athletic boosters for different, like Auburn and all these big schools, they're trying to kind of like have a little savings bank, like be the bank of NIL for a particular school. So let's say if you transfer to Auburn and you're playing on the offensive line, then you're going to have access to $20,000 that in NIL that comes through that booster group. So boosters are raising a lot of money and helping connect it to athletes, and that way, that's why the transfer portal is making Rick Pitino's life miserable every year. Or that's the kind of dynamic for it.
Did you want to speak a little bit about some of the research on women's bodies when it comes to sports?
Yeah, I just think, a lot of you guys are doing exercise science and movement science. So one of the things...
And I can show slides if you want me to put something up.
Let's go to Laufin.
Okay.
And show. So a lot of the thing about, we can't remove, the idea of what women can do is inextricably tied with our bodies and the expectations socially for us. So, and I think there's a really historical, I'm going to get to why I'm using here. And there's a really historical reason for that. Even when you go back in Western culture to the ancient Greek statuary, ancient Roman statuary, this is Laocoon and Sons. This statue itself is in the Vatican. And he's fighting off a snake, as you can see. This was probably, this is a 3,000-year-old statue. He's fighting off a snake. And all the statuary for Greek and Roman was based off of athlete bodies from that time. Men's athletic bodies were used. And you can just see, look even from the top of his arm, how he's straining. Every muscle is engaged. You can see really well, like the male form and all of its glory and activity. And now, if we can move forward. And here you have the epitome of womanhood. Grace, stillness, a lack of movement. This is Venus de Milo. This is in the Louvre. So again, when we even think about how we're thinking about our bodies and by gender, we have these ideas about what women's bodies are capable of goes back a long, long time. And women's bodies, particularly back in the late 1800s, there was a German doctor who came out and said, if women run long distances or exert themselves very much, their uteruses could fall out. So it's really important that they don't do that. And,
I'm looking for that.
Basketball's invented. Yeah, exactly. So literally, that was in a German medical journal, and it influenced. So remember when I said that the Boston Marathon didn't allow women until 1972? Olympics didn't have a marathon for women until 1984. So we're talking about this had a long hangover in our culture, this idea. So women's bodies were primarily thought to be important for reproduction. And if you were doing anything to impair your primary purpose, which was reproduction, that was off limits. So women often played sports or were allowed to be active because it was thought that healthy bodies would be better mothers. And so anything you were doing in service to the idea of your future motherhood was okay, but beyond that, not. So this is why when the first basketball games were held at Smith and Cal State, that the court was divided into zones, and you couldn't run from one zone to another. You had to pass out of those zones. So while men could run up and down the basketball court, women couldn't. And so I think, we think of these cultural
I got that picture right here, as a matter of fact.
And also, think about the clothing of the time, the corsets, all that's not conducive to run. You wouldn't run a marathon in a corset. You probably would have a hard time walking down the street in a corset. Some of them were so tight. So again, really limiting, because what is it that a woman's body is for? What's it used for? So, I think of also Lindsey Vonn just won a race. She's 40, the skier, and everyone was like, that's amazing that she won that race. Well, I think the question for a lot of you all is, what is the science on what women's bodies can do at different points in their lives? It was thought that women couldn't be athletes after they had babies. When I started covering sports, if a woman got pregnant, that was the end of her career. If she decided she was going to have a baby, that was the end of her career. So Kim Clijsters comes back, she starts playing, Serena Williams, a lot of soccer players.
Joan Benoit.
Joan
Benoit.
And Paula Radcliffe, who won the New York City Marathon in the early 2000s. You start seeing these women who do decide they're going to come back and play. And it's kind of met with this kind of BMI, oh goodness, mom wins marathon, like all of these kinds of like, man bites dog kind of stories with women coming back from motherhood to continue to play. But, there's some, anecdotally, a lot of the people who win those like real crazy endurance races where you're like out in the desert for 100 miles and, you run through the night and don't sleep. Sometimes women run those and win them outright against co-ed fields. I don't even think we really know what women's bodies are capable of athletically in some ways. When you look at Lindsey Vonn or somebody else, like, do we have limitations like that? Do we get, are some things about the way that we compete better with age? I played roller derby for 7 years, and I started playing when I was 38, which was young.
Is there an image of you out there and playing roller derby?
Heck yeah. Yeah, and Leslie Eviscerate was my derby name.
I'll find it.
I played for Suburbia Roller Derby in Yonkers.
Leslie Visser?
Leslie Eviscerate, after Leslie Visser, yeah. But I love full contact sports,
Yes.
and I love contact. That's why I enjoy covering
I
the
just had
NFL.
it.
That's a great sport to cover.
How do I spell it?
Eviscerate, but it's probably Visser. SSERATE. And then if you put Jane McManus, yeah. You may be able to find something on the interwebs. See Jane Roll. Oh, ESPN did a big thing on me doing it.
I'm not seeing, the image.
Yeah.
There's this. Pardon?
Images.
Oh, yeah.
Go up to see if there's anything on me. Oh!
Right here?
Yeah, that's me. Yeah. So. Yeah, I will say, I actually, yeah. So anyway.
Where'd it go? It went
You don't
somewhere.
have to, do not play the videos.
Okay.
It was mortifying.
All right.
Mortifying. But I'm saying like, I played at 38. If somebody had told me you're going to play a full contact sport at 38 on skates, I would have thought, won't my bones just be crushed and pulverized into a dust? But no, it was actually a lot of fun, and I loved playing and was very competitive against younger players. I just don't think we understand how women can compete, how their athletic ability changes as they age yet. So I'm curious about that when it comes to like movement science and science around that. I'd love to see more storytelling and data in that space.
Amy?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about all of the sort of alliances between media and sport, and women's sports in particular. We're not that different in age. I had the absolute joy of growing up very close to University of Connecticut, who in my lifetime has always had an amazing women's basketball team.
Yeah.
And so I'm just sort of thinking about the social media that we have now, the personalities, as you said, influencers, women athletes, women in general, but women athletes seem so much more externally interesting now than they did even 20 or 30 years ago. Right, so I'm thinking of like 1990s UConn, Tennessee women's basketball matchups. The spokespeople were Gino and Pat.
Yeah.
And Gino was like, we're gonna kill it. And Pat was like in her demure Tennessee lady, southernness, like, we'll see. There wasn't a lot of back and forth. And now because of social media, not publicly, right, in the media, traditional media, right? Now because we have all of these additional media sources, women who are athletes who are well known are allowed and encouraged even to speak a little bit more about what's on their own. So you have Simone Biles saying, like, I just need some space. I need to, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to risk my life. And she's saying it very publicly, very proudly, and the traditional media is then covering that in a way that they would not have covered that 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. The same thing, you have Dawn Staley, who's out there all the time, kind of smack talking in a delightful way. And the traditional media is covering it. You have traditional media covering, Caitlin and Angel and the alleged feud between them. There's no feud, but the traditional media is getting hits off of creating those dynamics.
Yeah, they're building the outside in the same way they build it around men's sports.
Right, which is then bringing more audience to those games. whether it's traditional, I'm going to sit down and watch a 2-hour Russia, or I'm going to watch some clips of the best moments of this game, or stream it, etc. And so just sort of thinking about kind of chicken and egg media coverage and women's sports, and how that's really just a very circular. They feed each other, and they continue. We're in a different place now with our media than we were even when you and I were at this age, the age of most of the people in this room, and the absolute beauty of that.
Yeah, so I covered the first year of the WNBA, the Liberty. And back at that time, the first year of it, they had Rebecca Lobo and Cheryl Swoops and three main marquee marketing faces. And they would literally put them in pretty clothes and makeup and have them pose and be like, watch the WNBA, what are you doing? And that first year, there were a lot of fans, or the WNBA was really going to convert the fans of men's sports. They wanted dads and daughters at those games. And a lot of groups of lesbians would show up, and different kinds of people would come, and older women, and they were not given the same respect as part of that fandom as that dads and daughters market. There was always this fear that if you talk too much about older women or lesbians or LGBT community coming in and watching these games, that you would scare off the fans that you really wanted, quote unquote. And I think that's changed completely for the better, because you think back to the bubble, the WNBA, when they came out in 2020, 21 after the end quote, during-ish, the end of the pandemic, I hope you can say that. They talked really clearly about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the owner of Atlanta, the Atlanta Dream, who was then running for a Senate seat. And they chose, after talking to Stacey Abrams through the WNBA Players Association, they chose to talk. They chose to come out with wearing shirts that said Warnock, the name of the opponent of Kelly Leffler, who was the owner of the Dream at that time. And this was highly political. You may agree or disagree with the WNBA's decision to do this, but they were leveraging their platform unapologetically in that moment. And what happened was Kelly Leffler didn't win the Senate seat, and the WNBA got more popular. I think there's a different buy-in, and I think we understand it a little bit more now for the fans of women's sports. If you're going to be a fan of, playing women's sports is in some ways a transgressive act. And rather than shying from that or not mentioning it, being unapologetic about it has actually won more fans over. The conversation around equity won more fans over. And so I think kind of the buy-in for being a fan of women's sports is understanding that it's different for the women who play, and understanding that they've had to be a little relentless. They've had to be a little, confident in order to get to where they are. And that's not something, you don't have to be doing your, pat summit on that or pretend it's not, that you're not trying to alienate anybody. You can wear the everyone watches women's sports t-shirt like Dawn Staley does to a press conference. And that's not going to scare off your fans. So I think we've kind of come to a different understanding, talking to your question about our audience is different. Colin Kaepernick really did polarize the NFL fan base. I don't think it happens the same way with the WNBA though. I think if you buy a ticket to watch, you're there for what they have to say. And so to me, they've been smart about leveraging that platform. And you have a league that's predominantly black women. So they should be forthright about that. They shouldn't shy from that. And you have an engaged union now, the WNBA Players Association, that is supportive of that. You have Kathy Engelberg, who's a commissioner, who's supportive of that. So I think it's a place that there is a difference, a meaningful difference, because and I think you see it reflected in Sedona Prince when she's sitting there and she's looking at that way. It's like, can you believe I have to deal with this? What year is it that I'm dealing with this? Why didn't you guys fix this earlier? And I think that's more the attitude that's brought now, and it's refreshing, frankly.
Back.
When it comes to, different racial groups, and everything, when it comes to representation, I feel like that for me, I like to look at athletes that have the same cultural background as me, as I am adopted, so so I feel like I want to be part of that culture, understand more of their culture and be part of it and such. Like, how does that work, I guess, with sports and such like that? With having with families and people wanting to support those other, like, kind of like, I guess, heritage and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see a lot of that. Like, you know, I think about Naomi Osaka, who is, you know, spent part of her childhood in the U.S., Long Island, but then also has, her father's Jamaican, her mother's Japanese, and she's able to talk about, and she's fluent in all of those different cultures. I mean, I kind of, you know, again, whether it's different kinds of identity, like, right, how LGBTQ, I think people are very, like Brianna Stewart, when she brings her daughter Ruby onto the court with her wife after winning the championship last year for the Liberty. You know, kind of that it's a visual way of being unapologetic about who you are, what your family looks like, where you come from, your culture. I think that's like people generally, I think, feel more comfortable with that now, not just in women's sports, but across the board. Certainly, maybe not with certain things when it comes to men's sports. We still don't have, you know, players who feel comfortable coming out in that context. But certainly in women's sports, it's completely acceptable, I would say, at this point. So I would say that, yeah, I think, and also the other thing I was going to add is when it comes to asking what you need that is gendered. So, you know, back in, again, a million years ago when the 1999 World Cup women's team, two of them had children, young kids. They pooled their resources to pay for a nanny to come with the team. Now, they didn't ask for two U.S. citizens for that. So now, I think players in women's sports are unapologetic about asking about what they need. Like, you have a population of people that are in their peak childbearing years. Some of them might have kids. You've got to accommodate that as opposed to, like, Cheryl Swoops, I interviewed her a couple years ago. And she was, like, so worried when she got pregnant that first year in the WNBA that she was going to let everybody down. Because how is she going to play again? And I think, so those are kinds of, those are things that are really different now, whether it's motherhood, you know, if you need a lactation room, if you need anything, it's fine now to have that be part of your job and your workplace, and to be unapologetic about. So there are lots of ways I think that athletes are representing for themselves and being vocal about what they need. Even with the WNBA, when they do every year, they pick a platform or something that they want to advocate for. So whether it's voting rights or, again, for a league that's predominantly black women, they also do a lot around maternity health, which impacts black women more than white women. The rates of infant deaths and complications at birth are much higher if you're black in this country. So I think it's a really appropriate way for them to use their platforms. It's been meaningful. Yeah.
In our class, we are looking at different programs that we can kind of focus on people who are much older that have children and that kind of want to still stay involved with sports or anything that they're interested in. What inspires you to continue doing that as you get older, especially with children?
Well, I think, you know, a lot of people do it for weight management. I think especially as you get older, like, you know, it becomes much harder to regulate your weight or to change it in any way. And, you know, yeah, so I think a lot of people keep up with it for that reason. But I also think it's kind of community. I wish there were more leads available. One of the first stories that I did when I was hired as a high school writer was I did a story on all of the recreational leagues for adult women in my area, which was Westchester County. I was a basketball player. I wanted to play basketball. So I was looking for a league. I had a really hard time finding it. This is, you know, back in the early 2000s. I played adult basketball for my town, which was a men's league, except for me. I was, you know, I was the reason it was adult basketball opposed to men's basketball. But so I was kind of looking for where are those teams and stuff, thinking like I'm the first wave after Title IX. I matriculated. It's been part of my life. Why aren't more women who came in playing sports in high school continuing that? So I do think that's actually a huge factor. Like it's huge for community. My roller derby, like women I played roller derby with I'm like to this day, they're still some of my best friends when we go out. And, you know, it's been 10 years since I played, but we're still, you know, all in the group chat and getting together like once every couple of months. And I remember actually when I played roller derby, when I joined, my kids were like 3 and 5. And there were like maybe 5 or 6 other women who had young kids also. And we'd like bring them to practice and they, you know, get into nonsense, you know, around the rink as we were skating. And, but it was just like a really great community. I think that's a lot of the reason why, like in particular, it's really hard to stay involved and to stay active unless you're doing running or triathlons or something that you can do alone. And I think what we're really missing are the opportunities for women to stay active into later years, you know, beyond tennis. Like tennis actually does a really good job of it, but you know, that's an issue, yeah.
Do you think if like you had accessibility to like a program that was for older adults that were just solely based on things you used to do and love, that would have positively affected your community and people around you?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Especially like, you know, your kids grow up and they leave the house when you're 22 now. So, you know, like, yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of spare time now, but yeah, I do, you know, there are running groups, there are things like that. You find a partner to go run with. Maybe that's kind of what I do now. But yeah, I would love to be able to, like roller derby, my league ended up folding during the pandemic, so it's not even there if I wanted to go play anymore, which I occasionally do. But, you know, I could be a ref. I could still be a ref. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
So, among the disparities in professional male and women's sports can, for budget, medical resources, equipment, that stuff can all be found at the high school level. Do you think women's sports could benefit from looking at those high schools and their athletic directors and bringing in a younger phase to maybe balance those resources and influence it from the adolescent level so when they grow up, they bring it to the professional level too?
I don't think you can take somebody from one system that functions really well within a system that values equity, put them in a system that doesn't value equity, and expect them to be able to influence the rest of the system. I think that's probably asking too much. You make a good point about high schools having, you know, a lot of time, a lot of access for the entire cohort at the school to be able to play. And so I think what you have to do is look at why. Why is that? Why is there equity parity on one level that then disappears at a higher level? And I think part of the reason for that is what is the purpose of high school sports? What is the purpose of college sports? And I mean, you can fill in the blanks. I don't have to spoon feed the answers on that, but there are differences in the reason that we want high school kids to participate in sports and the reason that colleges as an institution are participating in college sports, particularly at the D1 level. Yeah.
What advice would you give to many of the current students that are just allies for women's sports to continue advancing this mission of equity across the board?
Sure. So I actually think your generation is in good shape, believe it or not. I think I see more women engaged academically in careers around sports now. You know, again, strength in numbers, but also, you know, I think men at your age are used to seeing women who are also fans and athletes in sport, you know, of sports. It's not, I remember when, you know, when I was getting into sports, or when I would talk about the NBA, I was in an NBA fantasy league back in 1994, well before I became a sports writer. And I would talk about like the stats on Jalen Rose. I had Jalen Rose and Brian Stiff on my team for the people who also were in the fantasy league back in 1994. And you know, when I would talk about those players, their stats, and people would go, "Oh my gosh, you're a girl, you like sports? Girls don't like sports." And I think there's less of that now. Like you expect the women in your life to be interested in sports. If you come across a woman who is interested in sport, it's not like, "This is a unicorn. How did this arrive?" You know, it's more like, "Oh, this is a woman who likes sports. Okay, they exist." You know, so I think that's helpful to you all, that expectation. I also think you all have also had a front row seat for the conversation around equity. And again, it doesn't mean that an NBA player and a WNBA player get the same amount of money in their paycheck, but it does mean that they might get the same percentage of revenue in their paycheck, like that as a breakdown. So, you know, again, the conversation is more sophisticated than just, you know, yelling points, kind of. And I think that, you know, the men at this age have had a front row seat to that as well. So that's the advantage, I think, that's baked in here. I think, yeah, so allyship is important, and I think, you know, so I had Sam Rappaport in my classroom in NYU yesterday morning. She is a VP of football operations for the NFL, and she's the reason that you have assistant coaches in, I think it's 23 teams now in the NFL, and more than Sarah Thomas in the pipeline for refereeing, and you also have a lot of scouts. She's responsible for placing a lot of women who know football into scouting roles, connecting them with different teams. And she said something that was really great, because I asked her, like, she had to use soft power. She didn't, Roger Goodell was on her side, but she didn't have any, you know, authority. She didn't have a police force that could tell Jerry Jones to go at a woman in the scouting department. And she said the way she looked at it was 20% of the people in any organization are going to be on board with you. They're going to be rowing in the same direction. They're going to understand what you understand. 70% are going to be like, okay, but how? You know, like maybe willing enough, but they don't understand how it's going to work, whatever it is you're looking at. And then 10% are people who don't think women should be in sports or hate whatever, you know, who are not going to be on board. And she said, don't worry about the 10%. You're not going to win them over. So she said, either the ground will move under them or they'll retire. But you shouldn't waste your energy when you can spend it on the 70% on that 10%. So that's the advice I would give you for moving into the workforce. Don't worry about the 10%, worry about the 70% and the allies that you have in the 20.
Other questions? Media and communications crew. Questions about process. One of the questions I had is what your communication strategy is when you're writing this
When I'm
book.
writing, well, I think actually so are your students, are you guys writing papers? Are you doing papers and stuff like that?
In my class, they're writing some papers, yeah.
So I almost think the writing is less important than the research and reporting that go into stuff. If you don't have enough information, you're never going to get a good story out of it. So it's going to extra sources. It's going to extra sources. It's talking to live human beings who know about the stuff you want to know about. I think that interviewing skills could be better for a lot of students at this age. You don't necessarily know everything. You have to go to people who do know more than you do, and you have to be able to have a conversation with them to get the information that you want. So being able to craft a question so that you can get targeted pieces of information back is super important. And so when you're looking at whatever it is that you're going to be writing about, what is the information that you need specifically to make your story or to make your essay communicate what you want to communicate? And then how are you going to people who can give you that information? I think in some ways, Google is your worst enemy. It's important for you to get the background or to get your ideas going, but you have to take it a step forward. You cannot have everything be from a screen. That's not where you're going to learn. You're going to learn more from being able to actually still reach out to people, get firsthand information, empathize with somebody, tell someone's story, that kind of thing, even in the context of a piece that you're doing for a college class. Last year, my final for the sociology of sport class was you had to have 5 sources and one of them had to be a human being who you spoke to directly. And the students who followed up with that and did a good job with that, their essays, their pieces were successful. So thinking about like how you can go about getting a piece of information that's going to take it from just like, these are things that that ChatGPT distilled for me and that I then went to follow up on Wikipedia, to a piece that is more comprehensive, that gives you a human being to look through their eyes and see this idea through them. I think that's super important.
I'm writing that down. It's going to be in the next mental exercise in my class.
I also sent my ethics class to the racetrack, off-road racetrack, which I was racing, because I think in sports we have a real good sense of the sports we love. I loved, the NBA. I certainly know a lot about football, but we don't know everything about every sport. And I think we have to kind of get beyond our own thinking about, oh, I know sports because I know this sport. Sports is bigger, Like you go to France or you go to the UK or you go to India, and there you're going to go, look at a sports section there, or you ask people what they're following, they don't know what the NFL is. They've never heard of the NBA, and yet they have a large and vibrant sporting culture. So what is it about sports that's bigger than just this sport? This particular volleyball, this, that. Like, there are reasons we're engaging with sports that are way up here, and they're ancient, you know? And I think it's really important to kind of, if you want to be a professional in the area of sports, being able to tap into that is super important.
Dr. Bloom, did you have anything?
A lot of this stuff's been covered, but I do have one, and it goes a little bit into politics. So, like, starting in the 70s, right? Mm-hmm. We had Title IX that passed, as well as a whole bunch of progressive legislation. And then lately, what we're seeing is some regression in terms of those legislative acts and like women's bodies and all that other stuff, our autonomy. And in your book, you say that sports is bodily autonomy.
Yeah, that's right.
So how much do you see? Because what I'm seeing is there's some cyclical notions. Like, we've always said that politics is a pendulum, but sport may be suffering from that pendulum too.
Well, of course, I mean, these things are all tied together. Like, the cultural expectations of women are never going to be disentangled from our ability to operate in professional sports. Professional sports is predicated on women having control of their, you know, having reproductive freedom. You know, we can only have women's sports at a large scale because women are able to decide when and how they have families. And if that's during their playing careers, that's great. But if it's all, you know, they also have to be able to put that off if they like. And yeah, some of those, the ability to do that, you know, even things like contraception being talked about, that's a big issue. So if the ability to have access to contraception went away, that would really affect women's sports. So I think, yes, I think there's no question that those forces do have an impact and will have an impact. And that's, you know, part of why the timing for this is, you know, being able to peel some of that back and not, you know, kind of give into this idea that it doesn't matter or that it's not at stake or that it can't be impacted. But in this country, we really do care about how much money things make, and we are a capitalist society. And the business case has been made for women's sports. And so as long as there is revenue to be derived, there will be insulation from some of that. So I think it's you know, again, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know how it's going to impact. You know, the Trump administration has come out with a couple of different orders that impact sports. One of them is saying that NIL money shouldn't be distributed according to Title IX. Title IX shouldn't have an impact on how that money is distributed. And the second is the establishment of a task force overseeing the World Cup. And which is interesting because the World Cup is a US, Mexico, and Canada bid. So again, you know, the administration is using sports in a new way by putting itself in an official capacity above the task force that had already been established and has been working to bring the World Cup to North America for the last 6 years. So I don't have a crystal ball on how that's going to impact, but it's clear that the administration does see sports in a different way than previous administrations have.
We're at our allotted time, and there is food out there available for you. So if you're hungry, go and have some. But I figured if there's no other questions, or if there are any other questions.
I did bring a box of books. If you are interested in it and you wanted to buy one, no pressure. It's $25, and I do take credit cards. So again, no pressure whatsoever. But if you were like, oh, this is interesting, I wish I could read more about it, just let me know.